هر که دارد هوس گرگ و بلا بسم الله هر که دارد هوس گرگ و بلا بسم الله هر که دارد به سرش شور و نوا بسم الله هر که دارد هوس گرگ و بلا بسم الله هر که دارد به سرش شور و نوا بسم الله هر که دارد هوس گرگ و بلا بسم الله هر که لبیک به فرمان خمینی گوید هر که لبیک به فرمان خمینی گوید به خداوند قسم راه حسینی گوید به خداوند قسم راه حسینی گوید هر که فرمان برد از روح خدا بسم الله هر که دارد هوس گرگ و بلا بسم الله هر که دارد به سرش شور و نوا بسم الله هر که دارد هوس گرگ و بلا بسم الله هر که دیدار حسین ابن علی می‌خواهد هر که دیدار حسین ابن علی می‌خواهد هر که دیدار ائمه و علی می‌خواهد هر که دیدار ائمه و علی می‌خواهد مبدش مهر و وفا عشق و صفا بسم الله هر که دارد هوس گرگ و بلا بسم الله هر که دارد هوس گرگ و بلا بسم الله هر که دارد به سرش شور و نوا بسم الله هر که دارد هوس گرگ و بلا بسم الله کریبلا کریبلا منزل عشاق خدا می باشد کریبلا کریبلا منزل عشاق.
I want to talk to you guys about Iran in the Iran-Iraq conflict, specifically in light of the death cult that has its grips over the Iranian nation. And this death cult really truly manifested itself in the Iran-Iraq conflict, which started in 1980 and ended in 1988. 1 million Iranians died in the Iran-Iraq conflict. And many of those who died were teenagers. They were a part of the largest faction of the Iranian military. It was called the Basij. And the Basij, they were an army of teenagers. That was the Basij. The Basij was nothing but an entire army of teenagers, 14-year-olds, 12-year-olds, who were either extremely undertrained or had no training at all. At best, they would have a few weeks of training. But for the most part, these young men had zero training, and they had no weapons. They weren't getting AK-47s from the Soviet Union. They had no weapons. And they were utterly brainwashed into believing that if they fought and died for Iran, that they would be fighting and dying for all of the saints of the Shia religion, for Hassan and Hussein and Ali, and they would be fighting for the holiest site of the Shia religion, the city of Karbala, which is in Iraq. And they would end up in Jannah and paradise, where they would just have sex for all of eternity. And so 1 million teenagers with no training, and 3 weeks of training is not training. No training, were just running right to the Iraqi tanks. And the Iraqis were just mowing these teenagers down. They just kept mowing them down, taking them out, blowing them up with their tanks, shooting them, just slaughtering these teenagers. And it got so horrendous that even Iraqi soldiers were on the verge of losing their emotional composure because they were tired of slaughtering unarmed young men, unarmed teenagers, for hours. There was one Iraqi soldier, and I'm getting this from a book that I have been reading. It is called Germany and Iran by German scholar Matthias Kunzel. It's a very good book. It is on the subject of the German-Iranian alliance, the history of the alliance, and also it does focus on the current situation, the current political situation between Germany and Iran. And the book does have a heavy emphasis on history, which is completely understandable because in order to understand the present, you have to understand the past because things really don't change all that much. And so there was a quote from an Iraqi officer, and this is quoted in the book, and it says here, this is talking about the teenagers who were running right to the barrels of the tanks. They come toward our positions in huge hordes with their fists swinging, an Iraqi officer complained in summer 1982. You can shoot down the first wave and then the second, but at some point the corpses are piling up in front of you, and all you want to do is scream and throw away your weapon. Those are human beings, after all. So even the Iraqi military, which was described by the Americans as being brutal and ruthless, even Iraqi soldiers felt bad. Even Iraqi soldiers just felt unsettled by the fact that they were butchering teenagers for hours. And so many Iranians died fighting against Saddam Hussein's army. Saddam Hussein's army was way more trained, way better trained. They were way better armed. Remember, they were getting weapons from the U.S. And also, the Iraqis were just a lot more intelligent by the way they went about things, by the way that they utilized strategies of war. And also, the Iraqis were just, they were more strategic. Remember, the mullahs who took control of Iran, they killed all of Iran's best generals. The Khomeini was paranoid about a coup being done against him, so he just had all the best generals in Iran butchered. Remember, much of Iran's military was trained by Germany. Germany also received Western military technology. Remember, and this was a part of the whole Iranian hostage conspiracy. One of the deals that the Americans made with the Iranians is that, hey, you let the American hostages go, and we'll give you weapons. And so the Iranians were also getting Western military technology. It's not like the Iranians were completely hopeless in war. The problem was that the Ayatollah Khomeini, the Mullahite regime, butchered Iran's best generals. So there was really no helpful minds in the Iranian military. Iraq, on the other hand, had all of their generals. They didn't kill their generals, and they had Western assistance as well. They had Western military technology. So the Iraqis were just a way better military in comparison to Iran post-revolution, 1979 revolution. And so the Iranians, they began to resort to what all death cults resort to, and that is just mass slaughtering of their own people. You see this with Jim Jones, and the Jim Jones situation was a microcosm of what happened with the Iranians. The Jim Jones situation was Jim Jones knew that the American government was after him because a U.S. Official was murdered by the Jones cult, and Jones knew that it was done for him. So he's like, well, I'm going to kill myself, but I'm going to have all these other people die with me. So tons of people were murdered by the cult, and they say that these people drank the Kool-Aid. I think most of them were forced to drink the Kool-Aid. Most of them were murdered. Yes, there were suicides, but a substantial amount of them were just murdered by the cult. That was really a microcosm, and I know Iranians weren't drinking poisonous punch, but nonetheless, they were in a very extremely desperate situation in which they knew that they were going to lose. They knew that they had no serious military capabilities. They knew that they had no strategy. So what do? Well, we'll just kill a bunch of our own people. That's what happened. Iran came under the control of a charismatic religious cult. One of the most common questions that we have gotten here at Shubat.com is, what's the difference between a Sunni and a Shia? What's the difference between Sunni Islam and Shia Islam? Well, one of the major differences is that Sunni Muslims are not as charismatic as Shia Muslims. Sunni Muslims are more intellectual. Sunni Muslims are more logical. Shia Muslims are more charismatic. It's kind of like the difference between a Catholic Christian and some charismatic Christian in the bayou of Louisiana. The Shia do not really use, they don't use intelligence to their full capacity, right? Now, that may change in the future. We keep hearing about an Iranian threat, so perhaps Iran learned from its mistakes. But when you look at the two different religious factions, Sunni and Shia, you will see that the Sunni are not so much obsessed with emotion as the Shia are. The Shiites have an entire religious ritual called Ashura, in which they cut themselves and they beat themselves and they cry over the murder of Ali and the murder of Hassan and Hussein. Ali was the nephew of Muhammad. He was murdered by the Sunnis. And then Hassan and Hussein, the sons of Ali, were also murdered by the Sunnis. Ali was murdered in a mosque. I'm pretty sure it was a mosque in Karbala, Iraq, which is why the Shiites to this day consider Karbala to be their most holiest city, which is why you will find all these videos on YouTube of Iranian soldiers singing Karbala, Karbala, ya la da da la da. They're singing in reverence for this city. After years of fighting, the Iranians were just continuously getting butchered by the Iraqis, and Saddam Hussein said, okay, all right, guys, let's have a truce. Here are my terms of peace. I'm giving you the chance to surrender so you can end the bloodshed. And the intelligent Iranians, the more level-headed people in the Iranian military said, let's take the terms. Let's take this chance to end the war and have peace because our people keep getting butchered. And the imamate, the imam-ran government, the cult-ran government of Iran said, no, we must continue the war because bloodshed is more important than having a normal life. And so the war continued on for another 6 years. And the Iranians eventually had to surrender because they were getting slaughtered. 1 million Iranians were killed in this conflict. The Shia cult that ran Iran and still runs Iran, they have this idea that bloodshed is more important than victory in war. So you could have 1 million Iranians dead and lose the war, but you don't really see that as a bad thing because 1 million people are in heaven. And so while these imams, this Ayatollah Khomeini is sitting comfortably, all these people are being butchered. And you had all of these preachers, all of these imams going to these poor neighborhoods in Iran, these poor villages and towns, and telling young people to go out and fight for the imam. Go fight for the great imam. You know, you're fighting for the 12th imam. And here's the thing. After years of being slaughtered, the Iranians had to do something to boost the morale of the soldiers. So what did they do? They got this Iranian guy, they put him on a horse, they put a turban on him, and they rubbed his face with some kind of phosphorus substance, and it made his face glow. And he starts riding up to the soldiers, and his face is glowing, and these Iranian soldiers, these teenagers, are freaking out, and they're like, who is this? And he says, I'm the 12th imam. And they really believe that this guy was the 12th imam. They really believed he was the 12th imam. And he said, continue fighting, fight for Karbala, fight for Ali, Hussein, Hassan, whatever. And all these Iranians kept on fighting because they truly believed that what the person that they saw on the horse was the 12th Imam. And little did they know that this was an actor. It was an actor. And you had these imams coming out saying, well, we keep sending these teenagers out to die. What do we do? Let's get an army of donkeys. Yeah, this actually happened. So they sent an army of donkeys, and the Iraqis fire their tanks. At the sight of one explosion, all the donkeys ran away. It came to the point where the Iraqi soldiers were just losing their minds. Like they just couldn't keep killing these people. I mean, it wasn't even much of a fight. It wasn't really a fight. Now, the Iranians, they did put up a very strong resistance, but they weren't that well trained. They weren't well armed, and they had an army of teenagers that they were just being butchered. Now, a lot of this goes right back to the Shia obsession with death. There is a quote that I want to read to you guys. It is from 1850, and it was written by a writer named Elias Canetti, who was a Nobel Prize winner, and he wrote an eyewitness account of the Ashura festival, in which Shiites cut themselves and beat themselves over Hassan and Hussein and Ali. And look what it says here. 500,000 people in the grip of delirium covered their heads with ashes and beat their foreheads against the ground. They want to subject themselves voluntarily to torments, to commit suicide in mass. What was I saying about what happened in Iran being a microcosm, being really a huge manifestation of the microcosm of a death cult, which is the Jonestown cult? They want to commit suicide in mass, to mutilate themselves with refinement. Hundreds of men in white shirts come by, their faces ecstatically raised towards the sky. Of these, several will be dead this evening. Many will be maimed and mutilated. And the white shirts dyed red will be burial shrouds. Others, who were not at first among the volunteers for self-sacrifice, suddenly discover their thirst for blood amidst the general uproar. They demand weapons, rip off their clothes, and tear their flesh. There is no more beautiful destiny than to die on the festival of Ashura. The gates of the 8 paradises are wide open for the holy, and everyone tries to get through them. And so this religion, this death cult, it really did show itself, it really did manifest itself in the war between Iran and Iraq. And it was like fighting the Japanese. The Japanese had a similar obsession with death, although the Japanese were a lot more strategic about it because they were well armed and very well trained. Nonetheless, the sentiment was still there. It's one of the reasons why the Americans decided to nuke 2 cities, because they knew if you kept fighting the Japanese, you would have more. Listen, if the Americans never nuked Japan, you would have ended up with way more dead people. You would have ended up with way more dead American soldiers, and you would have ended up with way more dead Japanese civilians. And the reason is because the Japanese had this idea that as long as they kept seeing American soldiers, they weren't going to stop fighting. And this is really crazy. I remember years ago reading an account of the, pretty sure it was the Battle of Okinawa. And it was one of the last battles before the Japanese surrender. And the Japanese said to the civilian population, everyone get whatever weapon you can get, samurai sword, whatever you can find. We're all going to fight and die in this war against the United States. And the Americans saw this. This is a death cult. This is an absolute death cult. I mean, there was no way that these people were going to stop. The only way you could get them to stop is to just nuke their 2 major cities and force the emperor to surrender, because the emperor, he doesn't want to die. It's amazing that all of the members of these death cults, they're being told by somebody they're being told to kill themselves by somebody, and this somebody is the one that they worship. And the person who is telling them to kill themselves, he himself doesn't want to kill himself. So the one who is giving these people all of this inspiration to destroy themselves, does not want to destroy himself. And the emperor didn't want to die. The emperor didn't want to end up completely humiliated by defeat, so he said, okay, I'll surrender. And for the first time in the lives of the Japanese population, the Japanese people heard the voice of their God, because they believed that this emperor was God. They believed that. But they never heard his voice. And the only time they ever heard his voice was when he surrendered. Imagine that. This is why I think Israel is not too enthusiastic about going to war with Iran. Saudi Arabia is not enthusiastic at all about going to war with Iran because of the Iranian hysteria about killing oneself for the cause. There is a quote from Khomeini that I want to read to you guys. He says, quote, "The natural world is the lowest element, the scum of creation." Why would you call God's creation scum? God created the material world. He said, it is good. But here you have Ayatollah Khomeini saying it's scum. It really does reflect the Manichaean, Albigensian, Catharist nature of the Islamic religion. One of the beliefs of the Manichaeans, or one of the beliefs of the Gnostics, was that the crucifixion was an illusion. And in the Quran, it literally says that Christ was not crucified. It only appeared so. It only appeared as if he was crucified, but he was never crucified. This is what the Quran teaches. So in the Quran, you find Gnostic beliefs. And this Gnosticism, I think, really escalates itself. It really is amplified within the Shiite cult. This idea that the natural world is just crap, it's garbage. And you find this in Protestantism as well. You find this in Protestantism. You find this in the Calvinistic belief that we are just utterly degenerate. We're completely, utterly degenerate. We have no free will because we cannot make the decision to do good. We can only make the decision to do bad. And even in that, we have no control over ourselves. The God of Calvinism and the God of Luther also, I must add, because Luther also rejected free will. And Luther also taught that the God of the Old Testament was evil, right? He taught that the Ten Commandments was garbage, and that God is an imbecile, that God is stupid. The God of Calvin, the God of Luther, is Satan, because both Luther and Calvin, they believed that God created evil. In the Albigensian cult, there were two gods. There was the God who created evil, and the God who created evil was the God who created the material world, and there was the good God who created the spiritual world. What the Protestant Reformation did was it took these two deities and made it one. So yes, the God of Protestantism creates good, but he also created evil. So it's like you're taking the evil God and good God of Gnosticism and making them one deity. And then you also find this in Islam, where the man has no free will. In Islam is similar to Calvinism. Man has no free will. There's no such thing as free will. We're all predestined. Some people are predestined to burn in hell forever. Some people are predestined to be in Jannah and in heaven. And at least within the ideology of the Khomeini, of the death cult of Iran, the materialistic world is the scum of God's creation. So here you have this dualism. It's very similar to Gnosticism. It's similar to Protestantism also. So you see it right there. You see this cult. You see the absolute insanity of it all. You see within Iran this cult of death. And truly, this cult of death hasn't gone anywhere. It has not gone anywhere. It's still there, and it gets stronger every year. And it doesn't even matter if Iranians go from Islam to some sort of fervent mystical nationalism. That hysteria is still there. even if they go to some sort of Zoroastrian stuff, even if they dabble into some pre-Islamic Iranian religion, it's still there. And the reason why it's still there is because a lot of the concepts, the reason why it's still there is because the ritual of Ashura, of cutting oneself for God, that is pre-Islamic. That goes back to the pagan days of ancient Iranians, and that ritual still continued on. They only masqueraded it as Shia Islamic. So even if they try, because some people say, well, if they go back to their Zoroastrian roots, it's not going anywhere, because a lot of that fervency, a lot of that self-destructive hysteria, it's just pure pagan. And even if you look at the Islamic religion as a whole, yes, there's a lot of Christian influence, but there's also a lot of pagan influence as well. The death cult is there. Bottom line, it's there. Anyway, hope you guys have learned something from this video. You guys just heard some theology. God bless.